French composers on the turn of the 20th century created atmospheric music, mood setting, literally appealing to all the senses of the imagination, much less thematically driven, formally organized, and imitative of nature. Not necessarily as imitation for the sake of it, but more like a sound immersion in an atmosphere. And because at the same time you have two movements that are in parallel artistically for different forms of art that are going on in the same area, that is Parisian area mainly, the Seine River Valley outside of Paris all the way to the Atlantic Ocean side. First development then of railroad and the need to explore the landscapes. The music depicts wind with Debussy's preludes, at least in its title, placed purposely at the end of the piece so that you don't get to assume that the title is the connection to the piece. Is just more like a postscriptum suggestion to the atmosphere, which is created by the music itself. Or perhaps you have a Boat on the Ocean by Ravel. You have a lot of interesting combinations in Debussy's Image Book 2 between sounds and images about bells across the leaves of the garden or the goldfish in the pond. And so already the titles mention by themselves different information about what the music could be the reflection of, or is it that the reflection of the music brings us to think of this? And the other two movements that were very important at that time period were the Impressionist paintings and the Symbolist poets. Well, the Impressionist paintings, it's a little bit of a funny story. It's because in French, impression means fake. You give the illusion of something that is not, therefore academic paintings. A bit like in music, the lack of formal necessity to justify the music rather than the intense emotion of the captured moment, instant, shiver, sunset, sunrise, birds. Generally, more than the description of the elements of nature, it's the fact of being immersed in nature through the music suggesting it. And on the piano with shadow and lights, orchestration with colors of orchestra timbres. Same thing with the paintings, which of course at the time were considered fakers by the reviewers of the traditional expectation of the salons exhibits, because they were not academically painted with perspective and certain way of shaping the focal of the point of view of the landscape or of the treatment of shadows and lights. But in fact, There is also the meaning of the word impression, that is something like soulful connection to a moment which, while you live it in a daydream perhaps, or in the reality of your intense consciousness, um, makes you travel through the thoughts like you do when you read a novel by yourself and you enter an imaginary film or travel. It invites the performer, the listener, the reader to travel through these not fully described psychological moods. It leaves room for your own completion of them. In any case, when the reviewers of the French painters who are painting this way were writing their reviews, they say they're a bunch of impressionists, means bunch of fakers. And they took it as a manifesto instead of using it only as an insult by a reviewer. Now, of course, the blur, the pointillism, the idea that you can see it from far away, then from close up, it was not photographic. As a matter of fact, in 1830s already, photography started existing, granted in its first stages, but nevertheless, the paintings as portraits, commissions for wealthy people or famous people or rulers, were no more necessary. And the paintings that represented the atmospheres, the moods, allegories of spring for youth, or allegory of autumn for old age, or allegory of winter for death, all connected also with this movement of the French poets, the symbolists, who used analogies to depict life's seasons, experiences, again, spring, autumn, winter, and summer. It's not very cryptic, it's just poetically suggestive of a suspended time in which you immerse yourself in nature. And of course, you have to realize Paris, in the northern part of France, is humid and cold during 2/3 of the year, between late autumn and summer, and therefore not a place to wander carefree outside in nature, but summer and early autumn. And this rebirth of nature after the winter hibernation, literally, was a burst of new life, of new energies, of anything related to the exuberance of nature and the nature of humans within the nature. And therefore the music was more a sort of a soundtrack before its time of films which were of course silent at the time, but when they become talkies, they still have music in order to suggest the psychological emotion of what you're seeing, or anticipate the change of moods, or what you suspensefully should expect or fear, or something peaceful. So in a way, the music then is a complement to your immersion in the atmosphere. You can, of course, close your eyes and listen to the music only for the sounds themselves. They don't have to be the translation of anything, especially when there are no lyrics, so it's not a song. It's literally sounds. And the Germanic approach of music was always more formal, not only because it broke away from it in late Romanticism and Expressionism, and then it went away into post-tonality with serialism. In France, it was more about the French composers remained more perhaps traditional with alterations to the tonal language in terms of grammar, but then with the same chordal progressions without the same functions of tension release, of tonics and dominants. They were there to create these suspended moods where you feel like the piece has started without to announce itself and it disappears without having concluded anything emphatically. It was almost like the avoidance of being emphatic. And the fact is that poetry set in music was art songs for the French mélodies, like in German, Dichter with the poetry and the songs is the lead. And basically, you have music that is, in fact, sounds without words. And without a message, without a storytelling beyond waves, winds, sunsets, sunrises, and all what humans associate to the moments of nature. If sunset is death, sunrise is birth. Of course, it's not all so simplistic, but it does have a certain naivete to it, and also complexity that doesn't show its complexity. It's not a formal organization, it's not a structural language rewriting. It's more like using the existing materials, but using them in a way to express psychological situations. And so it's difficult to describe for a student when they learn it on the piano if they have not been immersed in these paintings and in this poetry. Of course, to be immersed in a poetry, you have to be able to really appreciate it by reading it in its own language. But even with translations, it's better than not. And not to say that the French music of the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th, is only necessarily connected to its time period, because you can listen to it outside of it and unaware of the Impressionist painters or the symbolist poets. It was simply modern in its own day, like all music of its own time. And the classification of the styles, the genres, comes from us, not from them. In fact, they didn't have to name what they were, they just were. We named them in order to distinguish them in our studies of history of music from the preceding and the following, as if chronology had to do anything with it only. Sometimes it's deceiving because you have people who regress in their musical language and people who are ahead on their musical language of their own time. The composers cook music in their inner worlds, and it comes out in a way that is perhaps misunderstood or not appreciated or banalized on the opposite spectrum. And who's to know what is its real worth, because it's only time that determines the worth. What humans do with it. Of course, if they have access to it. If they don't, then they pass next to something they missed without knowing that they did miss it. Or then they rediscover something, like Mendelssohn rediscovered Bach. For all of us, very generous of his. But you wonder why he was forgotten in the first place. Then again, it's more expected for lesser known composers. So perhaps in their own time they were way more established, and today they appear more miscellaneous in the lineup of our point of view of their time period when we study them. So who organizes this hierarchy? Probably self-marketing of some helped, then some who didn't market themselves and who got invisibilized by their contemporaries, and you might find them quoted in some dictionaries, but they wouldn't be the main characters. Long time ago, I was a great proponent of at the time, and still, alas, a lot, even now, forgotten composer by the name of one of many, specifically Gabriel Dupont, who composed Les Heures Dolentes, the painful hours, descriptive of his own illness in 1905, and how his moods and hopes and angsts were revealed through this musical autoportrait, using the same vocabulary of music as Debussy, who was writing his preludes in the same 1905. So they were contemporaries of each other, not necessarily imitating each other or inspired by each other. They coexisted, literally. And of course, Gabriel Dupont is forgotten since he died in his 30s, 1914. And if you hear him or his music being played, you will think, oh, it sounds like Debussy. Naturally, because that's the musical bath in which he was bathing. But because Debussy is this he's become so important that he probably would have been himself not very, I don't know, perhaps he would have been defining a whole time period of music on his own name. You could say that also for Fauré or Satie or Ravel a little later, or Poulenc a little after, or Francais much after. But all this is within the 20th century, after all. It's not exactly, part of the 19th ending. And every time period, every area, every era has its own, from whom we have scooped in the future what we think is the essence of their past, which was their present. And it lives in our present, because nobody plays Debussy as if it's a museum piece. It's because it's relevant to the imagination, the sensitivity and the coloring of the piano, shadows and lights, effects, as if he was composing it today, as a matter of fact. It's timeless once they die. Of course, we can put the chronology and we can say this is innovating and this is revisiting the tradition, Brahms, Debussy, Poulenc, Boulez, in the two different directions. Yes, if you live long enough, even Haydn in 1809 when he died saw more of Beethoven than he thought he would. In the evolution of the classical style he established in Vienna, I mean, to us perhaps it's less striking, but to him it must have been staggering. The audacities of the past that these composers used in modulations, in atmospheric innuendos, are perhaps lost to some of us because we take them for granted, because we've heard more dissonant or more contrasting synths, and doesn't mean that it's lame in comparison, but you have to take it within its context and live in a bubble as if you can isolate yourself today from the awareness of how music evolved since the composition of this piece. Which is intellectually not very easy to do because it demands the intelligent and cultivated and acquired taste, knowledge, awareness, as well as the connection to the music for itself, by itself, by the sheer intuition that brings you to it. It's not because you are explained, analyzed, or depicted by an art historian, a painting, that you like it more. You might understand it more, but if you didn't like it, you might not like it more because you understand it more. It be that if you are hooked in the first place, not knowing why you like it, that you're curious to know about it. Reversely, it's harder to start liking from having first studied. It's basically what we do in a second language, which we do from the grammar to the spoken. Whenever the mother tongue is from the spoken and heard, of course, mainly, to the written after. And I find that this spontaneity of connection to music is to the mother tongue needs to remain so, despite of the awareness, knowledge, and acquired taste, developed to appreciate things that on the perhaps intuitive level you might have not connected to. Strikes me a lot as a different level of connecting to the same material. And imagining how the deceased composers would have been surprised, puzzled, or amused by the way, through the filter of their notation and the indications as well as the teaching and we receive and the comparison with other performers, we end up playing their music. Perhaps they would be puzzled themselves. I never thought of that, they might think. It's not supposed to be that way, as some teachers say. But ultimately, that is the level of the how, as a performer, you involve yourself enough to become a convinced translator of this text from paper to the tablet to sounds through your technique and your touch technique and your imagination of colors. And do you get to express some percentage of all these that brew in your inner world when you play it? Well, yeah, sometimes it's frustrating. Most of the time is puzzling. But I find it very important to accept that the music is its own idiom, and therefore, even if it's evocative of nature in the French tradition of the early 20th, late 19th century, we don't just play an imitation of nature, we play the music and we should play the music itself. And the imagination of it, whichever it is for us within ourselves, shouldn't be limited and wouldn't be, because the listener is free to have their own perception according to their culture, their awareness, their mood, their conditioning. If they discover is different, if they compare and contrast with other performers of the piece, then they become more cultivated and therefore critical. Ignorance is bliss, but when the awareness is there, then inevitably dissatisfaction becomes part of it. It can be perfectionism for a performer, it can be pickiness for the listener, but why not? It's an evolving situation where it reveals itself ephemerally to you through a performer or yourself playing it in a way that's different from the other time or from another person. I find myself, even in performance of pieces I've practiced of this time period, I surprise myself daydreaming while I play. Of course, I'm not entirely playing on autopilot. I'm anticipating all the elements of technical approach to it, the pedal, the phrasing, the acoustics, the dynamics, the left pedal, the rubato, the breathing, the imitation of this or that instrument of an orchestral imagination, or whatever analogy, the touch, the dynamics, the voicing, the disconnection of the elements or the bunching of them, the layered music or the combined music. Perhaps the heightened awareness of the fact that when you play for people and you want to communicate what it means to you, your conviction of the piece, ultimately the piece itself, erasing yourself in order to not overwhelm it with your emotion or meaning that you put over it, or what it means to you to play. It's so many levels that enter in account in our approach of the heart of the work, beyond its everything, just itself, the language of music by itself. To me, it's always like getting lost in daydreams. Hopefully not during performance, because then I would stop playing, so it's not productive. But if I'm only mundane and very organized for the synergy of all the gestures and shiftings and organization of the fingers and the hand and the management of the arm and the muscle, and anticipating the fingering for the section, how to handle it best or reliably so, with the unexpected of the moment that inevitably happens, since you don't play on the instrument on which you perform when you practice, and most of the time not in the acoustics of it, and your awareness of the acoustic is also not the same as the audience, since you're sitting behind the instrument you play and they're listening from where you project the resonance towards. So you have all kinds of filters through which you go from first hearing it in your head, then producing it, then hoping it matches. Once you start playing it, like a conductor conducts, but the orchestra plays, the conductor doesn't play. And you're your own conductor in your own orchestra, your own recomposer, your own stage director if it was an imaginary stage, or a soundscape if you were a painter, or a poetic statement. Scriabin went as far as combining colors in the synesthesia with sounds. You can also organize to think of words with sounds, and without being spoken or sung, just hinted. So it's a lot of suggestion more than persuasion. To a certain extent, the acceptance that it's not going to go through the way you planned, but you'll give the impression while you do, because you have to go from point A to Z in the piece, in performance, for the integrity of the work as well as for respect for the audience. Therefore, even if the details don't correspond to how you practice them, imagine them, the transitions don't smoothly do their job, you realize little is in your way of deciding. It's almost as if the circumstances decide for you, and you give the illusion that you're managing the unexpected as if it were planned. And that, I think, teaching the right way to approach it in terms of the fingering and securing patterns allows to have a certain technical base, which allows you then to let yourself daydream without to get lost, either for the memory of the piece, or either for the details of the notes and the pitches and the rhythms and the patterns with the pedal or less pedal. Sometimes the acoustics by themselves make you hear it in a different dimension that almost makes you lost after practicing it in a small room. Or is it because you're emotional at the idea to bring it at its best for what you love to do with the piece and share with your audience, and you don't want to mess it up, as we say? It often appears as if this kind of music is improvised, but in fact is very detailedly written. But so well detailedly written that the writing of it is not heard in the performance, like the bar lines are not heard unless it's a military march, because the beats. So therefore you hear just phrases, statements, melodic moods, atmospheric, harmonic progressions or non-harmonic progressions. You just hear a flow of events, and you're aware of them, or you catch them if you know the piece, to recognize them if you could, and if not, you try to make sense of it if you could. And if it doesn't always need to make sense, just be in it as a listener and let the performer take you by the hand, so to say, and bring you to the highlights of what it means to the performer to play the very piece. So in fact, the best performance is the one that appears to be improvised while strictly played, is written. Just like actors telling their lines that appear to be spoken and not recited, even if it is artistically.